dinner of the Secret Doctrine. And one of the difficulties, of course, is what to put in and what to leave out when one is trying to give an overview, because there are so many concepts and principles, of course, presented to us, as well as the fascinating commentaries that expound and expand those principles, that one, of course, longs for time to develop it more thoroughly. And some of you know that we have done that here at the Krotona School in the course of a number of years, gone into much more depth. Yesterday, I attempted to suggest that there are certain fundamental themes in looking at the cosmogonic process from the mythological point of view. That is, myth gives us a key to certain fundamental motifs, archetypal motifs, if you will, that are found in all the great myths, and that indeed, to a large extent, can be found in the whole process as outlined in Volume 1, dealing with cosmogenesis. I would like to just supplement a bit of that by saying that, as you know, we found a great difficulty in distinguishing between what is called the motif of the mirror process and the motif of the reflection process. And it occurred to me, thinking of this later, that perhaps there are two better terms. One always continues to refine the terms, although I had taken those particular terms from, again, a student of mythology in the Jungian tradition, Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz, who has given an analysis of creation myths. So I had used terms which she had used, but perhaps even better would be to use terms which HPB uses in answering a question in the transactions which is printed in the transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. I'm not sure that I can find the exact reference right now, which is always the case, that one knows where the reference is and then it disappears from the page when one looks for it. This is one of the amazing things about, what happens to words. They absolutely disappear from the printed page and reappear magically when one is not looking for them. But I know in general what I want to say, and that is that perhaps the better words would be, first of all, from that unknown, which is the first of the great motifs, that absolute, which is unknown. It is an unknown. It's a universal reality underlying everything. From that there is a projection, and rather than the mirror principle, a projection. Then from that there occurs emanation, and reflection is, in that sense, the emanation principle. HPB is very clear on this in the Secret Doctrine, in the sense that there are perhaps two ones. The one on the plane of the unknowable, and that was the only way in which she could express it, which does nothing, but by its very nature, the only word that can be used is projects. And it perhaps is close to that principle spoken of in the Bhagavad Gita. With one portion of myself, I pervade the universe, but I remain. Nothing, in other words, has happened to that original one. However, from that second one, from that projection, there is then an emanation. And the emanating process is the reflection process. Well, it is in the transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. has disappeared from the page. However, you can find that it may reappear if you look into it. But it occurred to me that those might be two better words to use, projection and emanation, and I think may clarify to some extent the mirror and reflection principle. Well, this morning I want to turn then to volume 2 and see if within the time that is available to us this morning we can find out what is taken up in Anthropogenesis in volume 2. Now again, I've called it the myth. The myth, I haven't put that on the board, but man's origins and development. If we can begin to see it, not so much in its historicity, in its facticity, that word that I've become fascinated with, which Dr. Herbert Winther uses in his book, The Matrix of Mystery, which to me is a very beautiful book that expounds one of the great Tibetan texts, which comes very, very close to the Secret Doctrine, again indicating that this philosophy, this esoteric philosophy, Trans-Himalayan, is indeed rooted in that particular source. So again, not referring to so much the historicity or facticity of the statements, as indeed referring to patterns, archetypal patterns, and therefore to look at this pattern. And one of the profound doctrines of the esoteric philosophy, which is very much emphasized, is that man, and we'll come to what is man, man is the repository of all the elements in the universe. For our system, now I always have to add that, because there are other systems and other evolutionary cycles, other what are known as manvantaras, great periods of world systems. But for our particular system, man is the central point. He is the repository of all the elements in the universe. And I think this concept is not fully appreciated, of course, by contemporary thought, especially contemporary science, although in psychology it is coming to be realized and recognized in a very unique way. All things reside in man. He is the epitome of all that is, the microcosm of the macrocosm. And again, this is spoken of in the Secret Doctrine, that man is the microcosm of the macrocosm. He is the measure of all things. This, of course, was the Greek concept, particularly Anaxagoras. I'm sorry to stumble over that. But he was, in the Greek philosophy, even in Plato, the measure of all things. And now this does not mean, and we must be very careful, this does not mean that in each of us as individuals, we've necessarily developed everything, quite obviously. And this is why in many of the creation myths, even, man is a kind of half-baked creature. And so we can even speak of ourselves as half-baked, if you like, to use a modern term. But on the contrary, all of the powers, all the potentialities, as indeed the third object of the Theosophical Society suggests, the powers latent in man, these are divine qualities. These are capacities that are only partially developed, that only feebly show through the veils which enshroud our divine nature, but the potentiality is there. And in addition, the esoteric philosophy teaches that man also holds within himself the history of all inferior types, all lesser types. That is, we are the repository of all that has been, as well as the repository of all that will yet be. So we have been, we are, man is and has been and will be the foremost of the hierarchy of evolving entities on our earth. And he is the storehouse, the repository of all future types, as well as all past forms. And he throws off, this is one of the subtle concepts which we find, that man throws off those types as he evolves through the ages. And each becomes in its turn a new stock, as it were, subsequently following its own line of evolutionary development. Dr. D. Perucker, certainly one of the great students of the Theosophical world, and an author of many very fine books, Dr. D. Perucker called this concept the concept of the vital throwing offings. The vital off-throwings. It's an interesting term that he came up with. It's a doctrine that is rather mysterious. It does not mean that the various species or types were or are the bodies in which we once lived or will live, but rather that we are what Buddhism calls, in a technical way, alaya vijnana. We are the storehouse from which all lower forms originated and towards which they are ultimately striving. This becomes, indeed, a fundamental proposition then. It is very clearly stated in the fundamental proposition of anthropogenesis that for our particular cycle, man came first, preceded all mammalian forms. This, of course, is really shocking to contemporary science, although less shocking today than it was 100 years ago because of some of the advances in this whole science of anthropology, paleoanthropology, and similar sciences. One writer, for example, who's a paleoanthropologist, Matt Cartmill, has really put this all in focus from the point of view of its value to us in an article in the magazine Natural History just a few years ago, a very interesting article which is called 4 Legs Good, 2 Legs Bad. Our place, if any, in the universe. He put it this way: what we think about our place in the universe affects what we are prepared to believe about human origins. How we got here may not tell us anything about what we are, but it has a lot to do with what we think about ourselves and our place in the universe. It's a very interesting statement. So what we're talking about in a concept in its deeper metaphysical aspect is really the fact that there is a man pattern, and that for our particular cycle, it is that pattern, that archetype, which becomes the archetype for the entire system. And that man pattern has been called the heavenly man or the divine paradigm. In the Secret Doctrine, in Volume 1, page 106, we have then the statement, the doctrine teaches, this gives us the clue to it, that this is a fundamental principle. The doctrine teaches that in order to become a divine, fully conscious God, even the highest, the spiritual primeval intelligences must pass through the human stage. And when we say human, this does not apply merely to our terrestrial humanity, but to the mortals that inhabit any world. And now she defines it. That is, she says, to those intelligences that have reached the appropriate equilibrium between matter and spirit, as we have now, since the middle point of the 4th root race of the 4th round was passed. Now immediately you will say, if you're not familiar with the whole teaching, what is meant by the 4th round, what is the 4th root race, and so on. Again, because we're doing an overview, these are topics then that are gone into much more thoroughly in terms of this teaching in the Secret Doctrine. But the point is, and she emphasizes it then, each entity must have won for itself the right of becoming divine through self-experience. And this is the point that I've already emphasized, the pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy, that we must win our immortality. That it's not something that's just sort of assured there. It is assured in one sense, but we must make it self-conscious through self-experience. So she speaks, HBB in volume 1, page 107, and the very next page, speaks of this subject as being so very mystical and therefore the most difficult to explain in all its details and variants. Now, if it was difficult to explain in these 2 volumes, all of these pages, how much more difficult it is to attempt to condense it in a brief overview. But that we must do, because, as she says, this archetype is indeed the paradigm of creation, this pattern of the cosmos. She says further, on page 183 of volume 1, every form on earth and every speck in space strives in its efforts towards self-formation to follow the model placed for it in the heavenly man. So we have to look a bit at what is meant by this archetype, that there is indeed a pattern. This is what we see, incidentally, in those great creation myths that deal with sacrifice, the motif I mentioned yesterday of sacrifice. One finds this in the Hindu mythology of the Prajapatis, the creative deity Prajapati divided into 100 parts. One finds this in the Egyptian myth of Osiris into 14 parts, to be put together again, to be reassembled. That is, the parts are everywhere in the universe. And it is Isis who stands, of course, for nature, for the mother principle that unifies, must discover these. We have this in the Greek myth of Dionysius. Dionysius divided into 14 parts. The murder, almost, in Chinese mythology, it's the murder of the original man. One has it in Norse mythology, as I mentioned yesterday, in the giant Ymir, whose very body becomes all of the parts of the earth. So there is this remarkable doctrine of the archetypal pattern, and it is the human. And the clue to that is, as she puts it in the quotation I've just given, to those intelligences that have reached the appropriate equilibrium between matter and spirit. Now, one of our difficulties, and I think this becomes a difficulty at many places, is pointed up by Sri Krishna Prem and Sri Madhava Ashish in the book to which I referred earlier, Man, the Measure of All Things. They say it very, very beautifully. Divine man, the quintessence, and that's the sort of the fifth element, which is not the synthesis, not the combination, not the adding together, but that which emerges, that which underlies them. Divine man stands as the middle term of the extent of being. His essential self is the unmanifest and transcendental root of self, the Father light. His essential self, that is the essential self of our being, is the unmanifest and transcendental root of self. This self is the wonderful all-knowing person of universal mind. And again, his self is the individualized spark of incarnating mind. So we use the same term, self. We use the same term for that root, that transcendental root in which we are all rooted, which is one. I'll put this on the board in a moment. We use it for the all-knowing person of universal mind, we may say not the essential. The first is the essential self. The second is perhaps the actual self that we know. The third, again, his self, the factual, from the actual to the factual self, the individualized spark of incarnating mind. And so they say further, Pramanashish, man, on whatever level we speak of the self, it is only in ourselves that we can find any experiential point of reference. Only in ourselves that we find any experiential point of reference. Never by any means can it become an object of the senses. So we really have to understand then, what is man? And these principles then are sevenfold, HPB suggests. The principles then are sevenfold, and we begin to understand what is the paradigm, why this becomes the pattern. And we can list them then. I think I'm going to list them in a different order. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Why not? Let's be Chinese in this, you see. Now the seventh principle, and I'm doing this because of the stages of development, because I want to point out, you see, numbering is interesting. And in one place, HPB says that one doesn't need to worry about this numbering, because in each individual and at each stage, one principle may be first, may have priority, and the other is not. So it really does. But, our minds like these neat systems, don't they? You say, part of us very much wants to know just exactly where it comes. So the seventh principle is Atman, or Atman in the neuter. Sometimes you will see it Atman. I reserve the term Atman generally for the universal. Its particularized localization in the human, a kind of point which is dimensionless, is Atman, if you like. It is that individualized breath. It points in the Fritz Kuntz used to use this term, a localization, because it's a point is dimensionless, isn't it? You see, fundamentally. So this is the universal, the essential self, if you like, of Praman Ashish in this statement that they make. The unmanifest and transcendental root of self. Now the moment you say root, you begin to think of a point that begins to spread out. It is united with the sixth principle, buddhi, and these together, of course, are the monad. That is, now we're getting into the localization. It's beginning towards becoming individual, if you like. And so Atma Buddhi is known as the monad. It is activated always by manas. And this becomes then the central point from which then this can become active in the realm of manifest existence through manas. One finds this very much, I might say, in the Mahatma letters, and I think the term is used of manas, that it Atma Buddhi activated. Virginia can tell me if I'm correct on that.
One place where it's explained very clearly.
Very clearly, isn't it, in the Mahatma letters? And isn't the word activated by manas?
I believe so.
I think that is the term that is used. And here, then, is the crucial point of the human stage, the appropriate equilibrium. Manas, often sort of divided, as it were, that is to say, it has a dual characteristic. It's polarized. Manas is, I very much object to, I might say, to works that say there is a lower mind and a higher mind, because there is really only one mind. There is only manas. As a principle, it is one. In its functioning, it is dual. So one must distinguish the principle from the functioning of the principle. Clearly distinguish that. Because in its operation, it becomes dual, it's functioning. And so there is that aspect of manas which moves outwards into kama, and I'm using now the Sanskrit terms. There's a certain advantage in using the Sanskrit terms, as HPV did. They have less of the affective feeling to them than many of our English words have, don't they? You know, we react because when words become very familiar to us, they take on more and more connotations, emotional connotations, and we resist them, you see. But when we use Sanskrit, we're coming closer to awakening this other faculty of which I spoke on our first morning together. So drawn out by kama, which draws it into a realm of action, draws mind out into an activity. Kama has often been translated as desire, and then we get into all sorts of problems when we simply translate it as desire. Well, should we have desires? Should we desire this? Should we desire that? Well, whether we should or not, we do. You know, let's be honest about it. You may not, desire chocolate cake, but there it is. If a piece of chocolate cake is before you, perhaps you decide that, well, it would be silly not to eat it, so to say, you say. Well, in all sorts of ways. So it is drawn outwards through kama. Then it has its own energy. And later, I might say, this was left out. I'm not going to go into that, but use it here. It has its own life force, its own vitality. Therefore, because there is a principle, it actually, we mustn't see this in some kind of static ladder-like formation. These are all interpenetrating. They are all present within us, right here. Absolutely present. They are all interpenetrating. Then it begins to take some kind of, it assumes a pattern, a kind of structure, an interior structure, if you like, a pattern, which is known in the technical literature as the linga sharira. That is the pattern vehicle, the pattern body. It is the subtle vehicle. Later called, in some of the later literature, the etheric, but it is that pattern vehicle which then takes absolute form in the stula, or gross sharira. The gross or heavy or dense vehicle. These then become the principles, and they can be given in a variety of ways. You may recall that it was over this particular issue, those of you who are already familiar with the Secret Doctrine, it was over this particular issue, over this particular classification, that indeed Subaru took some objection, because as a Vedantist, naturally, he was concerned with the Vedantic fourfold classification. That is, that there is only one principle, which is Atman, which operates in a variety of fields, fourfold fields, you see, or upadhis, that is, that which nourishes this essential principle. And so one has these vehicles, these sheaths, not really vehicles, because that, in a sense, again, you see, body, some of the literature uses the bodies, which again is a word I don't like, because it indicates a kind of stability. And yet there is no stability, not even in our physical body, as we know, even though this is the abiding place, which is bodhi. A body is the Anglo-Saxon, from the Anglo-Saxon bodhi, an abiding place. It abides temporarily in these fields. And so these abiding places, these nourishing places, and so the term in the Vedanta that's often used is upadhi, which is simply a term that means it nourishes. It's that which holds, the container which gives nourishment, just as you would put a plant in a container with soil around it, which is going to nourish the roots and help the plant to grow and help it to develop what it is to be. And so there are the causative and the subtle and the upadhis that are of knowingness, vijnana, manas, and the dense. This is the densest, you see. But even that is in constant, we're beings in process, aren't we? All the time. Even the physical body. Certainly you don't have the same physical body today you had yesterday. It may not look too much different today, although perhaps if you had a huge meal last night, stepped on the scale this morning, there is some alteration in the weight of the body, and so on. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody myself, but the body is in constant change. You can look at a picture of yourself 25 years ago, and certainly there is change. And yet somebody who hasn't seen you for 25 years may come up to you and say, well, I would have known you anywhere. You look just the same. Well, obviously you're not the same. So there is a constant movement in all of these vehicles. Well, as I say, it was over this that, of course, Suvorov differed with H.P. Blavatsky. And there is a distinction here between the presentation of the sevenfold system and the Vedantan system. But HPB makes this very clear also in Volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine. She points out that whatever system of classification is ultimately adopted, all true occultists must be familiar with what is known as the Taraka Raja Yoga system, which is that system I just described, the Vedantan system. So what we're looking at is principles and how they function. They are all present. They are all present. And this is the important thing. They are all present from the beginning, but not awakened, not active, not activated. And we will see this. Therefore, to activate them really, HPB says that there is needed a triple evolutionary scheme. And this again is where the concepts of this philosophy differ from ordinary science. We've already, to some extent, mentioned this whole concept of evolution. But HPB points out, Volume 1, page 181, and this is essential to the teaching. Therefore, I'm going to read it rather in full. It's quite a lengthy statement, but it has to do again with the teaching that is helpful as a background for understanding anthropogenesis. She says, it now becomes plain. I always love it when HPB in her writing says, well, it's really quite understood. Now it becomes plain. And one has been struggling for pages to understand what is being presented. But at this point, she says, it now becomes plain that there exists in nature a triple evolutionary scheme for the formation of the three periodical upadhis. Now you see why I have spent some time on this particular work, because this has to do, I'll put it in red, this triple evolutionary scheme with the upadhis. This term, upadhis, the D-H-I, which is the same as the root verb in dharma, incidentally, is the nourisher of that upa, which is the holder, the container, the sheath, you see. So it is that which nourishes the three upadhis, the three periodical upadhis. And that's why I went into a bit of, where am I? Sorry, I'm mixed up with this. However, we like action on the video, so the action of my getting unmixed. The formation of these periodical upadhis, there's a triple evolutionary scheme, she says, or rather three separate schemes of evolution, which in our system are inextricably interwoven and interblended at every point. Interwoven and interblended at every point. These are the monadic or spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical evolutions. Now you begin to see why I put this in this particular way. Because we have then, first the monadic, doing this very well. Do it better. The monadic. And you see why I use this term here to help you. The intellectual, and the physical. So there are three, but you begin to see now why these principles then are in this form, and the evolutionary scheme, then a triple evolutionary scheme, interwoven and interblended at every point for us in our particular scheme. These three, she says, are the finite aspects or the reflections on the field of cosmic illusion of Atma, the seventh, the one reality. This is why I went through the principles first. And then this is a unique teaching, the triple evolutionary scheme. Then she expounds upon it. The monadic, as the name implies, is concerned with the growth and development into still higher phases of activity of the monads in conjunction with, two, the intellectual, represented by the Manasagyanis, the solar devas, the givers of intelligence and consciousness to man, and three, the physical, represented by the chayas of the lunar petries. Don't worry if you don't understand all these terms, because that's not essential at the moment, round which nature has concreted the present physical body. And I'm sure that if you had had a vehicle as large as 4-HPB with its numerous illnesses, the physical body, with its numerous illnesses and so on, you would have used the word concreted too, because it must have felt as though from that blazing spirit within her, that blazing fire of magnificent beauty and truthfulness and so on, that the physical body was indeed fastened on with concrete. So I'm sure that's one reason she used the term. This body, she says, serves as the vehicle for the growth to use a misleading word, and the transformations through manas, and owing to the accumulation of experiences of the finite into the infinite, of the transient into the eternal and absolute. It's a statement that really deserves a great deal of thought and study. And much, much is contained in that simple little statement of the triple evolutionary scheme. But now you begin to see why I have said manas is the turning point, you see. Manas is definitely the turning point in the whole evolutionary cycle. And therefore, it is that central point which marks what is man. There's a great mystery to it. And I think that again, is a marvelous study. As she says, the intellectual, represented by those who are the givers of intelligence and consciousness to man. These are known by many, many names in the Secret Doctrine. The coming of those great sons of mind, those great lords of understanding, if you like, that awakened the monastic principle in nascent humanity. But the growth begins from below upwards, as we will see after our break. But I wanted to suggest that knowing what are these principles, the sevenfold principles, then beginning to see them in terms of this triple evolutionary scheme. Let me just perhaps indicate this. So the monadic is the growth of the monad, the Atma Buddhic, with that portion of manas that is able to stimulate the growth. The intellectual, the monastic and kamic principles, and the physical. I'm leaving prana for the moment because it suffuses the whole level. The physical through the linga sharira and stula sharira. And this is interwoven and interblended, but necessary is indeed the physical as the embodiment which produces, makes possible the growth. All right, let's I would like now to turn more specifically to the contents of Volume 2 and to point out that for this series on anthropogenesis, HPB postulates three further fundamental propositions. We've spoken of the three propositions that are basic to the entire Secret Doctrine. Now she gives these, and we don't have time to really examine them, but I think we should notice them, at least, take note of them, because again, they're fundamental to an understanding of anthropogenesis. The first deals with the simultaneous evolution, she speaks of it, the simultaneous evolution of 7 human groups on 7 different portions of our globe. A full examination of that would, of course, require much more time than we have right now. But in one sense, and in one sense only, and I'm oversimplifying, so please keep that in mind, it deals with the suggestion, at least, the fact that all of these 7 principles are already in us, or that is, the possibility of their unfoldment is present, so that it is simultaneously present throughout the world, the earth, in terms of the fact that there is an exact correspondence between man's physical development, man's physical development and the condition of the planet on which he resides. So I merely throw that out. These are all hints. What we're doing is an overview, remember. And so these are hints for deeper study, for things that could be gone into. And this is one of the fascinating aspects, is that there is a correspondence between the physical development of the human being and the earth, or the locale in which he resides, the condition of the earth on which, or the planet on which he resides. The second is, of course, the birth, she says, of the astral before the physical. Now, when she uses the word astral, we have to keep in mind that it is different from its use in the later literature, and is indeed referring to that principle which we've designated the linga sharira. That is, it is the model body. So that the model is always given before its densification. And I think this is certainly very clearly understood. Most startling of all is one that I've already referred to, that man in this particular cycle, which is called a round, and again, we don't have time to explore in detail the subject of the rounds, the planetary chains and the rounds, the cycles that take place within the scheme of the whole evolutionary pattern. But that for this particular period, man preceded every mammalian in the animal kingdom. A remarkable statement, which again, we haven't time to explore, but I throw it out because these are the 3 propositions that have to be looked at and have to be dealt with to understand the esoteric philosophy in regard to anthropogenesis. I'm not going to deal with them, but merely throw them out at this point. But before we take up the study of the stages of development, which is the 3rd area I have put on the board, there are some concepts, some preliminaries that I would like to call your attention to. First of all, I think I've already mentioned that the stanzas, or the verses, or shlokas, if you prefer the technical term, the shlokas, which are given in volume 2, are given in a different order. They're given in a different form from those which were given and gave us the description of the cosmogonic process in volume 1. It's evident, very evident, for example, that what we've been given in volume 2 of the Secret Doctrine is far more incomplete than were the earlier stanzas. In fact, HPB herself states that only 49 shlokas out of several hundred are here given. Well, that's an amazing statement. Only 49 out of several hundred. So we have to assume that there is a reason why 49. She continues by saying, not every verse is translated verbatim. A periphrasis is sometimes used for the sake of clearness and intelligibility, where a literal translation would be quite unintelligible. So she has given us an indication, I think, and I merely propose this to you, a clue that there was a purpose in giving 49. She separated them into 12 sections and called them stanzas, 12 stanzas. But I think the important thing is that she has numbered these shlokas or verses consecutively, 1 to 49. So that there must therefore be some reason, it seems to me. And it seems to me that this has to do with the nature of man himself. That each of these principles, in effect, stands for 7 operating functional aspects. And therefore, there are what are known as the 49 fires. This is made very clear, I might say, for those of you who would like to pursue it further, in Geoffrey Barborka's book, The Peopling of the Earth, the 49 fires, as they are spoken of. Ashish, in his commentary in Man, Son of Man, points out that although the significance of this second set of shlokas is essentially the same as that of the first, the relatively homogeneous symbolic exegesis of the first set has given way to a mixture of mythology, allegory, and anthropology. And so we have to begin to separate this and begin to see, I think, as I've already said, that it deals less with historical events, or at least with events that can be historically verified, but in their reference to ourselves as what is human, the psychological development, that the real significance, therefore, lies in the symbolic account of the movements of consciousness within us, not in their concern with historical, geological, or anthropological events. And therefore, I treat them and feel that they should be treated as the mythological account of growth of consciousness. That they are a guide to our true nature and not, therefore, to the history of external evolution or the surface of our planet. But they really show us our origins and our way of return through the flowering of all of our potential, which is present because the principles are within us. And of course, our physical evolution does form part of the story. And so, naturally, there are references. And it's interesting that today, the contemporary theories of evolution are more closely approximating, at least it seems to me, more closely approximating many of the statements made by H.P.B. But what is important is that all of this is still present within us. I think this we have to keep in mind, that everything is still present. Perhaps there's another way to put it. All of the early stages of our own development, from infancy to whatever our present age may be, adulthood, we're all adults here, at least, even though of different ages, all of those stages are still present within us. This, of course, is a psychological fact, isn't it? And may have a very direct bearing on, indeed, how we act today. What is our behavior today? I'm not thinking of it in simply the Freudian sense, although certainly there is some validity even in the Freudian sense of events of our very early childhood, of our infancy, which may be forgotten, but which marked us in many, many ways. But also in the Jungian and sense, I happen to be much more of a Jungian than a Freudian, certainly these early stages of consciousness are still somehow present, and they have directed us, and they have marked the further development of consciousness. In the terms of the Secret Doctrine, in the terms of Anthropogenesis, these stages of development are referred to as root races. Unfortunately, I think a very a term that lacks the full meaning and has led to much, much misunderstanding. It is not a term that was invented by H.P.B., however. It appears to have been a term that was used first by A.P. Sinnott. And one finds it in the letters from the Mahatmas to Mr. Sinnott, the very fact that this is a term that the masters accepted. Use it if you wish. In one of the famous letters to Mr. Sinnott, one of the masters writes, let us agree upon terminology. Let us agree to what we're going to call these concepts. And makes the statement, our terms are nearly untranslatable. So you have to remember something I emphasized on our very first morning together, and that is that the presentation of this tradition was given in what we may call the vernacular, the English language as a vernacular, for the first time outside of the mystery schools, where another language has to be learned, where indeed a philosophic language, perhaps like Sanskrit or Tibetan. Tibetan is, like Sanskrit, is a deeply philosophical language. English is not. English is a language of commerce and trade, as it's often put, you see. And we don't have, for example, I referred earlier to the word self. That self can refer to different levels. And so we often qualify our words, don't we? The essential self, the egoic self, the personal self, and so on. But the word self, we find this, for example, with the word love. There is no more abused word, I think, in the English language than the word love. And yet, in the Greek, there were 3 words that described levels of love, or qualities or capacities that are functions of love. And so we have to recognize that there was this problem at the very outset, and that was, how do you translate terms that are either in the Tibetan or the Sanskrit? Sanskrit is a highly philosophic language, into English. And so the master was very clear on this. Our terms are nearly untranslatable. And it appears to have been Sinnott, so far as I can make out, who first used the term root race, or race. And to distinguish these major developmental stages, used the term root, which seems a perfectly legitimate term. And the term race in the last century was not pejorative in the same way it has become in our time, you see. And immediately it came to be assumed that we were talking about ethnic groups. And this is very clearly not what is referred to, but major developmental stages. Mr. Barborka, for example, made this very clear in much of his writing on this. These are major developmental stages. And today, in contemporary psychology, we are acquainted with developmental stages. In educational psychology, for example, the work of Piaget has given rise to an understanding that there are developmental stages in the student, in the young person. This is very much being focused on in a variety of psychologies, not only Jungian, but in many other, the Rogerian psychology, transpersonal psychology, humanistic psychology, and so on. And even educators such as Lawrence Kohlberg, the late Lawrence Kohlberg of Harvard, that there are moral stages of development, that these are not necessarily equated with a particular age, but that there are stages of moral development, and so on. So if we can see that what we're talking about when we say root races are stages of development of consciousness, then we can say that in the terminology of the Secret Doctrine, the first, second, third, and fourth races, or stages, are still present within us, although we are in the fifth developmental stage. And even in our very genetic structure, we are all that has ever been in the evolutionary scheme, biologically. And we know that in the prenatal life, within the early stages of the embryo and its development, we recapitulate the earlier stages of evolutionary development. So in our very genetic structure, we carry this. And there are studies now that indicates that there is but one genetic pool in the whole universe. There is one genetic pool, and we're all variations from that genetic pool. So there you are. Even at the biological level, we are brothers. We are indeed unified. There is a unity. And certainly at the highest level, if you want to use high and low, as this is always very interesting, somehow we picture spirit as high and matter as low. Metaphorically, this is a direction which is not meaningless, isn't it, to use it? But if you want to say at the very deepest level of ourselves, the very inmost level of our being, we are also one, as we are at the outermost, the biological level, we are one. But therefore, all of these earlier stages are present in our psychological structure. Consciousness is composed of strands from those earlier stages of development. And one day, and this I think is the main point that is also emphasized, that to realize consciously our full potential, we will have to face and deal with, which means become self-conscious of, those psychological aspects of our being that we've inherited from our own past. It's a staggering challenge, but I think it places in perspective our present stage of development with all its attendant problems and opportunities. So that all of this is now present within us. And we have to begin to recognize that we have to one day deal with all of these aspects. Well, what are these stages of development then? I thought I would turn, and you can see I've turned a great number of pages, to perhaps one of the easiest ways to summarize them. And that is by turning to one of the shlokas in this series of 49 shlokas. To just give you, first of all, the flavor of one of the shlokas, the difficulty of dealing with it, perhaps, but also to point out a kind of recapitulation. This is shloka number 39 of volume 2. It's on page 227 in volume 2. And speaking, therefore, of these stages of development, which, as I say, are called root races, the shloka reads, "The first on every zone was moon-colored, the second yellow like gold, the third red, the fourth brown, which became black with sin. The first 7 shoots were all of one complexion in the beginning. The next 7 began mixing their colors." Now, that doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? Until we begin to really look at it from, I suggest, both the developmental point of view from the triple evolutionary scheme, but also even more from the psychological scheme. Because here there is an order represented by colors. And while we may remember that different traditions assign different symbolic meanings or values to the various colors, we can see a clear movement, if you like, towards materialization or densification in this elaboration of the first, second, third, fourth, and so on. So we may note that at the outset, the 7 shoots were all of one complexion. That is to say, there was only the non-colored origination of Atman, which is no color, which is no color at all, and therefore of one complexion, because all human stock is rooted in that primordial field, Atman, if you like. One of the interesting things, I think, to note is that the word for color, or is often translated as color, in the Sanskrit is varna, V-A-R-N-A. But it also stands for figure, shape, outward appearance, covering external form, nature, quality, and so on. A wide variety of meanings which are attached to a term which HPB here simply translates as color. But it has to do with shape, form, appearance, and so on. And so the list of the races, or the colored races, represents the objective coverings, the spatial qualities, which make manifest the archetypal pattern externalizing through each quality-less spark on the different levels of the manifest universe. And the quality-less spark is of one color, you see, that is, which is no color. So we can begin to look at these, I think. It becomes logical to assign moon-colored to the first root race. And here we can begin then to recognize that we are dealing first of all with the physical evolution. And what is given to us is that a form must first be prepared in order for the mind, manas, to become activated. The principle is there. Remember, the principles are there from the beginning. But now, for our particular cycle, a form is necessary. And so we have the first root race, if you like, the first developmental stage, which is moon-colored. And that's interesting from a variety of points of view. First of all, because the teaching is that the stages preceding this particular cycle were within a cycle that was, of which the moon was the central or fourth planet, as it were, not our particular satellite, but therefore called a lunar cycle, as we are called the Earth cycle. I'm not going to get into that. I'll just throw it out. You have to look at it yourself. The word Chandra in Sanskrit, which is moon, literally means glittering. So it has to do with this very glittering, almost pure being, which is not yet in physical form, and therefore the Linga Sharira, the model body. It also refers to the fact that the moon, in that sense, was our parent, the lunar scheme. I'm not going to go into that. But one of the points is that with every developmental stage, a sense is developed. And the sense associated with this is sound. Sound. Which is quite logical, because the vibratory beginnings produce, as it were, sound. Notice that it's not the organ of hearing, the ear, but rather it is the reception, which is an overall reception of sound. The second, according to this, remember, the second stage, second race, is yellow, like gold. And that gives a greater stability, now begins to have a greater form, a hardening of form. And so to sound is added touch. And that, of course, is quite natural because as form hardens, one begins to touch a variety of things. And these, of course, refer to the physical evolution. These are very definitely within the physical. Now the third stage is known as red. And now we have, with the stabilization of form, the meeting of others, the movement that enables us to meet, and what arises? Pleasure, pain, we like some, we don't like others. And so it is desire, the awakening of kama. And it's interesting to note the sense that is now developed with this. It is sound in the first, sound and touch, now sound, touch, and color, which refers to the differentiation which sight brings. And HPB uses these terms. She doesn't say hearing, touching, and seeing. She uses these, as she speaks of the senses, as sound and touch and color. Color begins to differentiate. The world is no longer just gray, you see, as it's been. Now we begin to bump into each other, bump into objects, bump into each other, and so become red with desire. Our attention is turned outwards, and desire results in motion. And now we're swept into an action. We're swept away into action. And it is at the midpoint, then, of this developmental stage that there is awakened, then, the mind. This is one of the great subjects of the whole Secret Doctrine, the awakening of the mind, with the incarnation, actually, in this nascent form of a class of beings who have reached this stage, or developed this before, now take over for further advance. A great subject. And if you would like to really look at it more deeply, there's a wonderful little book by one of our great scholars of the Secret Doctrine, Adam Walker. And don't worry, called An Inquiry into the Nature of Mind. And I definitely refer you to it if you would like to really to discover what happened at this midpoint of this third developmental stage. Because it is a great story, a wonderfully exciting story. But it brings about a lot of problems. You know, the mind can solve many issues and then get us also into problems. So this is what happened. And consequently, the fourth stage, now with the intellectual development, you see, really in full swing, brown, black. Which is the densest point also, the densest point, if you like, attention really turned outward, a kind of final plunge, not only into physical embodiment, but now really stable, in a stable physical form, as it were, and now with the mind fully developed, not fully developed, but the mind really activated. And now, the very fact that the shloka says, brown with black, becoming black with sin, indicates that there is a moral awakening, a conscience awakening. With mind activated, we become aware of moral judgments. And the interesting thing, the sense equated with this is taste. this may remind you of the biblical story, which again, great symbology, great myth, that our humanity, represented by Adam and Eve, were not to taste of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You see? To taste of the fruit. You see? Tasting. Because there, and it's interesting that there is this emphasis, therefore, on the sense of taste, that with this full plunge, as it were, into physical embodiment, this full movement outwards, there comes then this awareness. We want to taste the world. We want to, and in many of the great myths, there's an eating of the world. There's an eating of fruit that's forbidden, or there's an eating of the world, or there's an eating of something, you see. The tasting, because only it's representative of, symbolic of, this deeper sense of awareness of choice within us. And I think it's interesting, the different flavors we begin to distinguish. Is something sweet or sour? Is something bitter or sweet, and so on, you see. So there comes a greater distinction, a polarity of the opposites, very much. And then the movement, which is only hinted at, the fifth, which begins a real mixture, because now clearly in the whole intellectual development, clearly here, and we have there the mixture, because it's all present within us. And the sense that is developed, interestingly, is smell. Sense of smell, HPB says. And it's, I think, extremely interesting. It's the point of interaction between the physical and these other subtle levels, entire range of the subtle worlds. And when I say smell, I'm always reminded of a statement in the Mahatma letters in which one of the masters, speaking of some individual, I've forgotten whom, Virginia may remember, but some individual, there is a moral smell as well as a physical one. And so there comes again a clearer differentiation. And yet, it's interesting how closely these two senses are related. As you know, if you ever have a very bad cold, what happens? Your nose is stuffed up, for example. You can't smell, and then you can't taste. They're very much intertwined, aren't they, these two senses, taste and smell. And yet, basically, we are able, by and large, to differentiate taste better than we are to differentiate smell. And this is psychologically shown. There's many psychological tests. But quite obviously, there have to be the sixth and seventh developmental stages yet to come. Very little is said about these stages, practically nothing, other than the fact that at one point HPB says that the sixth has more to do with psychology than with physics. She also makes other statements that are equally provocative, that the sixth sense may have to do with permeability rather than, certainly we're not talking about extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, or any of those things, but rather with a universe, the development of a sense which is a faculty not beyond the physical, but expresses through the physical. And so it seems to me, at this point, however, from the fifth onwards, we have to break away from our traditional habit of thinking in terms of linear progress. Our potentiality for evolutionary growth is now in a vertical or spiritual dimension, which has been really an active component in human history ever since, as Ashish puts it, the divine intelligence first shone out through the bright focus of the human mind. What is now required for the sixth and seventh, the remainder of the fifth, is a turning about in the seat of consciousness, as the Buddhists put it. And that turning about will probably constitute the sixth stage. Not in linear terms, but a new leap in consciousness. And that is the possibility. So this, we begin to see why you need to understand the principles, why the triple evolutionary scheme has its importance, and the developmental stages, which are here spoken of as root races, and you begin to see that this is indeed the most marvelous myth because it's the story of our own being in the world.